The hangar was enormous, echoing with the dull clatter of boots on concrete and the low hum of conversation. Rows of folding chairs were lined neatly for the audience, but many had already spilled into the open space near the aircraft parked along the walls. Old helicopters, battle-worn and scarred, sat alongside sleek jets polished to a reflective gleam. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of machine oil, gunmetal, and the faint tang of jet fuel. The walls were adorned with banners celebrating service milestones, units, and missions, but in the back, in the shadows, the past seemed to lurk quietly, as though the walls themselves remembered the sacrifices etched into every metal beam. The crowd was a mixture of hardened veterans, fresh-faced recruits, civilian family members, and journalists assigned to capture the event. Cameras clicked, and the occasional laugh or murmur rippled across the hangar. Some veterans carried the weight of their service. In the rigid set of their shoulders, the scars of battles fought in deserts and jungles far from home. Recruits fidgeted nervously, adjusting caps and lanyards, scanning faces for friendly recognition. Among them, the occasional officer kept a steady gaze, mentally noting discipline and posture. At the front of the hangar, a SEAL captain tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to fill the space strode to the microphone. He stopped, scanning the room with eyes trained by years of combat and command. The hum of chatter died down gradually, like water being drawn from a stone. "Any combat pilots here?" His voice rolled over the crowd, firm and demanding, carrying authority that left little room for doubt or distraction. A few heads tilted in curiosity. Some people looked around, unsure how to respond. Others chuckled quietly, thinking it was rhetorical, a standard icebreaker before the motivational portion of the event. Yet, in the far corner of the hangar, something subtle happened. A woman sitting quietly, back pressed against the wall, shifted in her seat. She didn't raise her hand immediately, nor did she make any sudden motion. But she straightened her back, drew her shoulders square, and the faint glint of determination appeared in her eyes. She wore a faded leather jacket over a plain t-shirt, dark jeans, and scuffed boots. Her hair was pulled back, simple, functional, no fuss, no hint of vanity. To the untrained eye, she could have been anyone: a mechanic, a family member, even a curious civilian. Nothing in her appearance suggested she had stared death in the face at 30,000 feet, that she had guided lives through chaos, that she had flown missions that most soldiers would not dare to imagine. But there was a quiet power in her stillness, a kind of unspoken authority that made heads turn, even before she stood. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, subtle but palpable. "Who is she? Does she actually mean it? Is that Lauren Kane?" Some older veterans stiffened, their memories flickering back to old headlines. Stories of a fearless pilot who had earned her medals under fire, who had flown missions others had called impossible. Others simply watched in curiosity, unsure what to make of the sudden energy she brought to the room. The captain's eyes scanned the audience, narrowing as his gaze landed on her. He blinked once, and then twice, almost as if confirming he had seen correctly. "You?" he asked, the single word cutting through the lingering chatter. Heads swiveled. Conversation stopped. All attention shifted to the far corner, where the woman now standing moved with quiet, unshakable confidence toward the stage. She did not hurry, did not hesitate. Each step seemed measured, deliberate, and yet effortless. It was the kind of walk that comes from years of discipline, where every muscle knows its purpose and every movement carries intention. As she approached, the murmur of speculation grew louder. Veterans leaned forward, some squinting, trying to place a face they thought they recognized. Recruits whispered to each other, trying to hide their awe. The air seemed to grow heavier with anticipation, thick with curiosity and disbelief. Some doubted her. Some felt a spark of inspiration. All felt the sudden charge of someone extraordinary entering their midst. When she reached the front, the captain studied her, his eyes sharp and assessing, as if weighing whether she belonged. There was a flicker of something unspoken in his expression: respect, disbelief, maybe even a touch of envy. He had faced his share of warriors, seen medals and records stacked before him, and yet here was someone who didn't announce her presence with boast or flamboyance. Her presence alone demanded attention. She spoke clearly, without hesitation. Major Lauren Kane, United States Air Force, retired. The words landed in the hangar like a hammer striking steel. Gasps followed. A few older veterans muttered under their breath, recognizing the name instantly. Newspaper clippings, mission briefings, battlefield reports, they all came rushing back in fragments to those who remembered. She had flown combat sorties over Afghanistan, navigating hostile territory and returning her crews safely. She had saved lives in moments when survival seemed impossible. And now she was here, standing quietly, waiting for the next question. The captain's brow arched. "Major Kane, hard to believe you're here quietly after all these years. Tell us, what's the most dangerous flight you ever took?" His tone was part curiosity, part challenge. He wasn't testing her. He was testing himself, trying to measure the magnitude of her courage. Lauren's gaze sharpened, eyes narrowing ever so slightly as memory surfaced. She spoke without dramatization, without flourish, letting the truth of her experience paint the picture. She described navigating narrow mountain passes at night, engine straining, fuel running dangerously low. Radar locked onto her position, tracing her every move. Enemy fire raked the terrain below, tracer rounds slicing through darkness. She explained how her co-pilot froze in the cockpit, paralyzed by fear, forcing her to assume full control in a situation where even a second's hesitation could mean death. The room went silent, each word landing like an echo of danger experienced firsthand. Some veterans stiffened, recalling the missions they themselves had flown, recognizing the precision, nerve, and raw courage required. Recruits leaned forward, wide-eyed, imagining the terror and responsibility Lauren must have shouldered. She continued, detailing how she descended into chaos, landed under heavy fire, loaded wounded soldiers, and took off again, engines groaning, aircraft barely intact. Every detail, from the roar of gunfire to the trembling hands of soldiers she carried, made the hangar vibrate with tension. When she finished, the captain didn't speak immediately. He simply studied her, the weight of her experiences hanging in the air. Around him, the audience processed what they had heard, some in disbelief, others in awe. They weren't just listening to a story. They were witnessing proof of extraordinary courage. Lauren had arrived quietly, without fanfare, and yet every word confirmed that she was someone the room would not forget. Even the smallest details, the worn leather of her jacket, the steady cadence of her voice, the calm in her eyes, told a story beyond medals or decorations. She was not there to command attention. She was there because her story demanded it. And for every person in the hangar, whether seasoned veteran or eager recruit, the impact was undeniable. A young Marine whispered to his friend, She actually did all that?" His friend, a fresh recruit barely out of boot camp, could only nod. Others shook their heads, incredulous yet captivated. Lauren had achieved what few dared, and yet she carried herself as though it was nothing extraordinary. The captain finally broke the silence, leaning into the microphone. "Major Kane," he said, almost with reverence now, "welcome. Tell us more." Lauren smiled faintly, not with pride, but the calm assurance of someone who had faced impossible odds and returned to tell the tale. The crowd leaned in instinctively. Every heartbeat, every whisper of movement, every shift in weight in the seats seemed to synchronize with the tension she brought into the space. Here was not just a pilot, not just a veteran, but a living testament to courage and restraint, and the room felt it in full. The hangar had grown almost hypnotically quiet after Lauren Kane's first words. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed muted, as if the space itself were holding its breath. Every eye tracked her movement. From the faded leather jacket to the worn boots, they clicked softly against the concrete floor. For a moment, it felt like the world had condensed, the hangar walls narrowing to frame a single figure, a woman who had danced with death in ways most people could scarcely imagine. The SEAL captain, who had seen more warriors than he cared to count, studied her intently. His brow furrowed slightly, a subtle mix of curiosity and incredulity crossing his stern features. "Major Kane," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years in command, "how did you manage to survive some of the missions we've heard about?" He didn't ask to interrogate. He asked because he wanted to know how someone so quiet and unassuming could possess such extraordinary skill. Lauren's eyes flickered for a moment, a tiny glint of memory surfacing. She remembered the desert winds whipping against the fuselage as she navigated through the rugged Afghan mountains, night vision goggles casting the terrain in ghostly greens. Her hands had been steady, trained to react without hesitation, even when the co-pilot panicked beside her. She thought of the soldiers waiting below, their lives balanced on the edge of her judgment and skill. "It's not about me," she said softly but clearly. "It's about knowing what has to be done and making sure those depending on you survive." The audience shifted in their seats, leaning closer as if to catch every word. Some veterans murmured among themselves, recognizing the cadence of someone who had genuinely experienced what she spoke of. For them, it wasn't just a story. It was a validation of battles they had themselves faced, the kind of understanding that only another person who had stared death in the eye could offer. Recruits, younger and untested, exchanged glances, wide-eyed, realizing that the world they had signed up for demanded more than courage. It demanded perfection under pressure. Lauren paused, letting the weight of her statement settle. The captain, sensing the moment, stepped back slightly, allowing the room to absorb the gravity of her presence. "Tell us about a specific mission," he encouraged. "One where you are truly tested." He did not anticipate theatrics. He wanted authenticity. And Lauren Kane, as always, gave nothing less. She began her story quietly, almost conversationally, but the tension in her voice betrayed the danger of the mission. She described a night where intelligence reports had pinpointed enemy activity deep in a narrow mountain valley. The mission was simple in description, but near impossible in execution. Evacuate a group of soldiers pinned down by an overwhelming enemy force. Radar would betray them, fuel was tight, and every second counted. She had flown through turbulence that seemed almost alive, buffeting the aircraft like a warning. The co-pilot's hands shook on the controls, but Lauren's were steady. Every maneuver, every adjustment, had been executed with precision, born of countless hours of training and survival. Her words painted the hangar in vivid, almost cinematic detail. The hum of engines, the crackle of radios, the flash of tracer rounds cutting through night skies, it all came alive in the imagination of her audience. Veterans leaned forward, some gripping the edges of their chairs as if they were back in the cockpit with her. Recruits held their breath, experiencing the adrenaline through the sheer force of her storytelling. The captain himself watched closely, noting how she conveyed danger without embellishment, commanding attention with authenticity rather than spectacle. The co-pilot's fear had become a pivotal moment. Frozen, hands hovering, unable to act, he represented a reality many had faced, the paralyzing terror that could cripple even the best-trained soldiers. Lauren described how she had taken over entirely, navigating into the valley, dodging incoming fire, and executing a landing that required both finesse and nerve. She loaded the wounded quickly, pausing only to glance at the faces of soldiers who depended on her. Every second she lingered increased risk, yet she remained calm, methodical, focused. The hangar seemed to shrink around the weight of the story. The photograph of the battered aircraft, the medals tucked into a pocket, the grainy evidence of bravery, it all made the audience feel the immediacy of her experience. The SEAL captain, who had faced countless men and women in intense operations, finally leaned back, allowing the room to witness Lauren Kane in her full gravitas. This was no ordinary speaker, no ceremonial figurehead. This was someone who had confronted terror head-on and returned, and the room now acknowledged it collectively, unconsciously nodding to the reality of her courage. Lauren continued, explaining the landing, the evacuation, the takeoff, each action punctuated by moments that could have ended in disaster. She described the soldiers' fear and relief, the quiet gratitude in their eyes as she lifted off the ground. She mentioned the engine alarms, the rivets shaking under fire, the almost tangible sense of mortality that hung in the cockpit. Every listener could feel the tension, imagining themselves in the same tight confines, aware that any mistake could be fatal. The younger recruits, some barely 20, were spellbound. They were being educated in courage and composure, without a single diagram, without a single how-to lecture, just the lived reality of someone who had been there. The older veterans, many with decades of service, recognized the subtle details, the way she described co-pilot coordination, the readouts, the mental calculation of fuel, distance, and enemy proximity. She spoke to their instincts, their memory, and their respect. Then she spoke of the moment of liftoff. The aircraft shuddered as it climbed, engines screaming under pressure, carrying the weight of wounded men, an impossible responsibility. The co-pilot, still pale, regained composure only under her unwavering guidance. She had to make split-second decisions, every turn, every adjustment, every reaction a matter of life or death. The experience was visceral, nearly cinematic, yet she recounted it without exaggeration, letting the raw intensity speak for itself. As she finished that portion of the mission, the audience remained suspended in silence. Not a murmur, not a cough, only the collective intake of breath that marked the recognition of something extraordinary. The captain cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone again. Incredible. And you did all that? Quietly, without fanfare? Lauren smiled faintly, shaking her head. Quietly is the only way to survive. Noise is distraction. Recognition can wait until everyone is safe. That's the rule of the air, the rule of responsibility. She paused, letting the weight of her philosophy sink in. It wasn't arrogance. It was lived wisdom. She had experienced terror, responsibility, and loss, and she had learned that silence often carried more authority than any proclamation. The captain nodded slowly. He had led men through firefights, commanded squads, faced impossible odds. And yet here was someone who had mastered the very airspace of life and death with a calm that challenged even him. Around the hangar, veterans exchanged glances. Some were visibly moved. Others were quietly recalculating their assumptions. She had entered a room full of warriors and subtly shifted the hierarchy of respect without a single boast. Lauren paused to look at the audience, meeting eyes, connecting in ways that went beyond words. Recruits, civilians, and veterans alike sensed the depth of her presence. She spoke of trust, of responsibility, of precision. She described the calculations in her mind, the split-second judgments that separated survival from catastrophe. She had flown into darkness, and she had returned, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as someone who understood the stakes fully. When she finally allowed the moment to settle, a subtle energy filled the hangar. People exhaled, letting their anticipation fade into a mix of awe and reflection. The captain, known for his ability to command, shifted slightly, acknowledging her mastery, not just of the skies but of storytelling, of engagement, of the human experience of war. "Major Kane," he said softly, "you've given us a rare gift today. Not just the story, but the lesson in composure and courage." Lauren's gaze softened, but remained steady. She had never sought praise, and the attention was almost incidental. Yet she knew the importance of presence, of giving those listening something real to hold on to. Silence, she understood, was often louder than words, and sometimes it carried more power than any medals or accolades. In the stillness, the hangar seemed to absorb her presence fully, acknowledging her story not as entertainment, but as truth lived and endured. The audience sat, many frozen, many leaning forward, all captivated. The younger recruits felt the weight of responsibility, realizing that courage and skill required more than mere desire. It required discipline, focus, and humility. Veterans, hardened by experience, recognized a peer, a comrade, someone who had faced the same unthinkable challenges and emerged alive, bearing lessons that could not be taught in books or lectures. Lauren Kane, standing quietly, yet unmistakably commanding, had done more than answer a question. She had reshaped the energy of the room, drawn every eye, and imparted a lesson in bravery, precision, and humility that would linger long after the hangar emptied. And as she took a small step back, allowing the captain to speak again, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. This was a presence that demanded respect, not by volume, but by weight. The hangar remained tense after Lauren Kane's story. The echoes of her words lingered in the air, bouncing off the concrete walls and steel beams like distant thunder. Every veteran, recruit, and civilian in attendance felt it the weight of someone who had walked in danger while carrying the lives of others on her shoulders. Even the SEAL captain, who had seen countless acts of valor, found himself momentarily unmoored, compelled to watch and listen rather than command. Lauren's eyes scanned the audience, noting reactions. Some were pale, lips pressed tightly in disbelief, while others leaned forward, absorbing every detail with the intensity of someone remembering a personal battle. She recognized a few faces among the veterans. Some had flown missions she had studied during training. Some had been pinned in combat she had only read about. Her gaze met theirs, and in that silent exchange, she conveyed respect, understanding, and shared experience. "Major Kane," the captain said, his voice carefully measured, "let's go deeper. Tell us about a moment when the outcome truly depended on you, when every second counted and failure wasn't an option." The room held its breath. Even the distant hum of engines seemed to fade. Lauren paused, taking a slow breath, recalling that night, that valley, and that mission etched indelibly into her memory. She began with the approach. The valley was narrow, almost a canyon. Mountains rose on either side, sheer walls that could shred an aircraft in seconds if misjudged. We had night vision goggles, yes, but shadows can deceive. Every foot of altitude, every degree of tilt mattered. Her voice, calm yet intense, conveyed the tension of the moment. She described the interplay of wind and rotor, the sudden bursts of turbulence that tossed the aircraft as if testing her skill and nerve. Her co-pilot's fear surfaced again. Hands trembling, eyes wide, he was frozen for a critical instant. In that pause, time had stretched to infinity. Lauren's mind raced through protocols, contingency plans, and split-second calculations. The passengers below soldiers, trapped under enemy fire, were counting on her. She had no margin for error. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the consequences would be catastrophic. She recounted the landing vividly. The aircraft lurched as it descended, engine strains echoing like growls of a wounded beast. Bullets chipped metal and rattled equipment. Smoke and dust swirled, and yet she maintained control, her hands steady on the controls, despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Every movement was deliberate, precise. She described how she had spoken in clipped phrases, directing the co-pilot and coordinating with troops on the ground, blending clarity with calm authority. The audience sat riveted. Veterans whispered softly, recalling similar high-stress moments, while recruits gripped their seats, imagining the terror and responsibility. Lauren continued, describing the loading of wounded soldiers. She spoke of the expressions she saw in their eyes: fear, pain, trust, hope, all compressed into a heartbeat. Some had injuries so severe that even a slight delay could prove fatal. Yet, under fire and chaos, she worked methodically, ensuring everyone was secured for extraction. She did not dwell on heroism. There was no flourish, no dramatization. Instead, she focused on the calculations, the angles, the timing, the constant adjustments needed to counter gravity, wind, and incoming fire. She described monitoring instruments while scanning the terrain, watching for signs of enemy activity, and managing her team's anxiety with calm, firm direction. Every detail, from the throttle adjustments to the subtle cues from her co-pilot, was a lesson in precision and composure under unimaginable stress. The hangar seemed to shrink around the story. Every listener felt it, the pulse of danger, the relentless pressure of responsibility, the quiet heroism that manifests not in recognition, but in survival. Lauren's voice painted the scene so vividly that the audience could almost hear the roar of engines, feel the tension of every second stretching into eternity. Her narrative was not just about survival. It was about mastery of self, of machine, and of circumstances that could destroy the unprepared. She described the liftoff with equal intensity. The aircraft shuddered violently, metal protesting the strain, and the wounded shifted, their movements tense with pain and fear. She guided the helicopter with a steady hand, adjusting for weight distribution, wind patterns, and the faintly visible fire on the mountainside. She spoke of using her peripheral vision to scan for threats while simultaneously monitoring fuel levels and flight paths. To the untrained, it would have seemed impossible. Yet she executed each maneuver flawlessly, a blend of instinct and rigorous training. As she spoke, Lauren's eyes occasionally flicked to the audience, gauging their comprehension. She noticed the younger recruits' wide-eyed fascination and the quiet nods of veterans recognizing authenticity. Even the civilians were leaning forward, caught in the narrative's emotional gravity. She paused to emphasize the teamwork required, how her co-pilot, once paralyzed by fear, had regained composure under her guidance, and how the soldiers on the ground had to trust her implicitly. The lesson was clear. Leadership under duress was not about authority. It was about steady, unwavering competence. The captain, listening closely, adjusted his stance, folding his arms as he processed the depth of her experience. He had led missions of his own, commanded troops under fire, but the combination of air and altitude danger presented a unique challenge. Lauren was not recounting tales of heroics for applause. She was imparting a masterclass in precision, courage, and human responsibility. Her calm under fire, her methodical approach to chaos, and her unwavering focus were lessons in leadership that even he could not ignore. Lauren then described the descent back to base, where every second mattered. Fuel was low, equipment battered, and adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Yet she maintained composure, guiding the aircraft through a tight landing zone, coordinating with ground support and medics, ensuring every wounded soldier was safely offloaded. Her narrative captured the physical sensations, the vibration of the rotors, the tension in her arms, the hum of the engines, and the emotional stakes, the lives she carried, the trust placed upon her, the silent prayers whispered by those relying on her. As the story unfolded, the hangar became silent in a way that felt almost sacred. Whispers died, cameras paused, even the ambient hum of activity seemed to cease. Lauren had drawn everyone into her reality, allowing them to witness, if only through words, the gravity of her mission. It was not sensationalized, not dramatized, just raw, lived truth. And in that truth, the audience felt the stakes, the tension, and the weight of responsibility that defined her career. She concluded that portion with a reflection on leadership. In moments like that, she said softly, yet with firm clarity, success isn't about glory. It's about calmness, focus, and doing what must be done. The lives entrusted to you are worth more than any recognition or medal. Every decision matters. Every second matters. And the quiet choices made in those moments define who you are. The captain leaned forward slightly, nodding. Even he, a man whose life had been shaped by combat and command, recognized the depth of what she had conveyed. Around him, veterans whispered to one another, nodding knowingly. Some younger recruits looked almost overwhelmed, realizing that courage under fire was more than boldness. It was composure, intellect, and relentless focus. Lauren Kane had not just shared a story. She had delivered a living lesson in responsibility and bravery. She allowed a brief pause, letting the lesson sink in before shifting focus. She spoke of the co-pilot's recovery, the teamwork, and the trust that had made survival possible. No one survives alone, she emphasized. Even in the air, even at 30,000 feet, it is about reliance, understanding, and shared responsibility. Courage is silent. True skill is often unseen. And the people you carry, they are what matters most. As she finished, the hangar was still. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, as though the room collectively absorbed every word, every nuance, every heartbeat that had defined that mission. Lauren's presence was a reminder that heroism was often quiet, uncelebrated, and measured not in applause, but in outcomes. She had entered a room of warriors and taught them, without boasting, the difference between noise and true action. The SEAL captain finally broke the silence. "Major Kane," he said, voice carrying a new respect, "your story. It's a reminder to all of us. Thank you for sharing it. There's something in your experience that speaks louder than any medal or accolade. You've reminded us of why we serve and why composure matters." Lauren inclined her head, acknowledging him with quiet dignity. She did not need to speak further. The audience, veterans and recruits alike, understood. She had told her story not to impress, but to teach. She had demonstrated that courage, skill, and leadership were measured not by applause, but by precision, responsibility, and quiet mastery under pressure. The hangar remained thick with anticipation after Lauren Kane's story. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to shrink, and even the distant echo of engines had softened into near silence. Every eye in the room followed her, some out of awe, some out of disbelief, and others because they instinctively understood that they were witnessing someone extraordinary. She had already captivated the crowd, but now the weight of her presence pressed deeper, an unspoken authority that demanded attention. A few veterans exchanged glances, subtle nods signaling recognition. They remembered news clips, battlefield reports, or whispered tales from colleagues of a pilot who had braved the most harrowing missions imaginable. Many had heard the name Lauren Kane, but none had seen her in person, standing quietly among them. And yet, here she was retired, understated, carrying herself with calm precision that only those who had faced true danger could truly master. The SEAL captain's sharp eyes scanned the room and then returned to Lauren. His voice, now quieter but still commanding, broke the tension. "Major Kane," he said, "we've heard your missions, your courage, but we still need proof. How do we know your stories are true? You've already stunned this room, but words can be powerful, and some may think you're exaggerating. Show us." A faint ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. A few skeptical voices whispered doubts. They were seasoned soldiers, trained to question, to test, to verify. For some, a story, even a true one, needed evidence, not only to validate the teller, but to remind listeners that reality could be harsher than any tale. Lauren didn't flinch. She had anticipated this moment. After all, she had spent her career balancing credibility with humility. From inside her leather jacket, she pulled out a folded photograph. The paper was creased, worn, the color slightly faded, but the image was unmistakable. Her helicopter, riddled with bullet holes, resting on a scorched landing zone. Soldiers crouched around it, bandages visible, even through the blur of action. Lauren held it up calmly, allowing everyone to see. The silence that followed was palpable, broken only by the low hum of the lighting above. She didn't need to speak. The photograph told enough of the story. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a medal, a decoration she had received for her bravery under fire. She didn't wave it or boast. She simply laid it on the podium, evidence of her service, of the lives she had risked and saved. Her calm, deliberate movements emphasized that recognition was secondary proof. Integrity and responsibility were what mattered. "This isn't about me," she said softly, her voice carrying easily through the still hangar. "It's about the people who depended on me, and the missions that couldn't fail." A veteran in the front row leaned forward, squinting at the photograph. "I remember that mission," he murmured. Others nodded quietly, whispering about news articles and classified reports they had once seen. Some of the younger recruits didn't fully comprehend the significance, but they felt it, the tangible reality that someone had operated under conditions most could never imagine and returned alive. The captain, too, seemed visibly impressed, his usual stoicism giving way to subtle acknowledgement. Lauren took a breath and shifted the focus. "I don't share these stories to impress anyone. I share them so you understand what it takes to survive and to lead. It isn't about adrenaline or daring. It's about discipline, focus, and responsibility. Every mission is a test of your ability to remain calm under pressure, to make the right choice when lives hang in the balance." She looked directly at the recruits, those new to military life. Their wide eyes met hers, and in that gaze, she conveyed something unspoken. Courage wasn't a flashy gesture. It was quiet. It was deliberate. It was unrelenting attention to detail in moments where mistakes could be fatal. The realization seemed to settle over the audience like a wave. One Marine, sitting near the aisle, finally spoke, breaking the reverent silence. "Ma'am, if that mission was real, then... damn, it's incredible. But how do we know?" His tone carried a mix of awe and disbelief. Lauren's gaze softened slightly, and she stepped closer to the podium. "Look at this medal," she said, holding it up for everyone to see. "Every name etched here belongs to someone I flew with, someone who trusted me with their lives. The photograph shows only a fraction of what happened, but the people who were there know the truth. That's proof enough." The Marine's eyes widened as he absorbed her words. Around him, the room shifted again, the remaining skeptics slowly nodding. Recognition wasn't being demanded. It was being earned silently. Lauren Kane had entered a space full of warriors and subtly reframed their assumptions about leadership, experience, and courage. She didn't need to shout or embellish. Her presence alone communicated authority. She then began to recount more subtle moments from that mission, moments the public had never seen. She described guiding the co-pilot's hands, steadying them with calm commands while under fire. She spoke of coordinating with soldiers on the ground, relaying critical information to medics while ensuring the aircraft remained stable. She described reading the wind currents, adjusting angles, and calculating fuel usage in real time. Every detail, precise and unembellished, painted a picture of someone operating on the razor's edge between life and death. The audience was captivated. Veterans nodded, silently acknowledging shared experience, while younger recruits seemed to shrink into their seats. realizing that courage under fire was more than boldness. It was skill, intellect, and unwavering focus. Civilians, too, felt the intensity, imagining the stakes involved in missions that they could scarcely comprehend. Every description, every detail, created a bridge between Lauren's reality and the room's collective imagination. Lauren paused briefly, allowing the gravity of her story to settle. Leadership, she said, her voice firm, isn't about making yourself look good. It's about making sure others survive, making the decisions no one else can make, and staying calm when everything else is chaos. That's the lesson I want you to take away. The captain leaned forward, elbows on the podium, studying her intently. And what about fear? He asked quietly. How do you manage it? Lauren's eyes reflected a momentary flicker of memory before she spoke. Fear is natural. It's necessary. It tells you what's important, what you need to protect. But you cannot let it control you. You acknowledge it, calculate your next move, and act. That's courage, not absence of fear, but mastery over it. A hush settled over the room. The younger recruits sat frozen, digesting the weight of her words. Veterans exchanged silent nods, recognizing the truth in her philosophy. Even the captain seemed momentarily reflective, his usual composure softened by the depth of her experience. Lauren then shifted to the human side of her mission, the relationships, trust, and camaraderie that defined survival. She described the soldier's eyes, the subtle communication of trust, the weight of responsibility that pressed down every moment. In the air, she said, you carry more than people. You carry their hopes, their fears, their families' prayers. One wrong decision, and you fail not just them, but everyone counting on them. The audience was spellbound. Every word, every pause, every subtle gesture conveyed mastery, responsibility, and humility. Lauren Kane had not only survived impossible circumstances, she had returned to share lessons that could only be learned through experience. Finally, she concluded, lowering her voice slightly, but with absolute clarity. I did what I had to do, because lives depended on it. I don't need medals to validate that. What matters is that those I carried made it home. That is the only reward that matters. The hangar erupted into a mix of quiet murmurs and slow, deliberate applause. The SEAL captain stepped back, eyes reflecting newfound respect. Around the room, veterans, recruits, and civilians alike recognized that they had been in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone whose courage, skill, and humility transcended rank, title, or recognition. Lauren Kane had stood quietly, proven herself, and taught an entire room the essence of courage under fire. The hangar's atmosphere shifted after Lauren Kane finished recounting her mission. Silence lingered like a tangible presence, broken only by the subtle hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Her words had painted a landscape of danger, precision, and responsibility that few could truly grasp, and the audience sat in awe. Veterans, recruits, and civilians alike felt the weight of her experiences pressing against their perception of courage. The SEAL captain, usually commanding and unshakable, leaned back, absorbing the lesson of quiet authority that Lauren projected. Lauren's gaze swept across the room. She noticed the mixture of awe, skepticism, and reflection in the crowd. Some young recruits had wide eyes and slack jaws, while older veterans exchanged subtle nods of understanding and unspoken acknowledgement that they recognized someone who had faced death and returned. She had brought the hangar to a standstill, not through dramatic gestures or grandiose claims, but through authenticity and presence. Every detail, every subtle nuance of her posture spoke volumes. The captain broke the silence with a question. Major Kane, why didn't you tell us sooner? Why wait all these years to share your story? His voice was quieter, more introspective than before. Lauren paused, considering how to answer. This question wasn't about verification or recognition. It was about timing, about understanding the reasons behind her silence. She inhaled slowly, steadying her voice before speaking. "Because," she said finally, "most people don't expect a woman to answer that question." A ripple moved through the audience, some confused, others nodding in agreement. Lauren elaborated, her tone even but firm. "Flight school, my early deployments, even combat missions, every step of the way, people assumed I wouldn't last. They doubted my endurance, my judgment, my ability to lead. And maybe I had to prove it not with words, but with action." The room seemed to absorb her words, leaning closer, as if to catch the nuance in her voice. Lauren spoke of instructors who questioned her stamina, peers who underestimated her abilities, and superiors who doubted her composure under fire. She recounted moments of silent defiance, staying calm in chaotic landings, taking command when others hesitated, making decisions that saved lives while no one was watching. Her story was not one of boasting, but of quiet determination, of resilience that needed no audience. The captain studied her carefully. His life had been defined by leadership under pressure, and he recognized the truth in her words. Leadership wasn't about bravado, it was about competence, reliability, and the ability to inspire trust without demanding it. Lauren's narrative exemplified that principle. Even the skeptical Marine from earlier sat forward, suddenly silent, as he processed the depth of her experience. Lauren continued, shifting to moments after her missions. She spoke of the emotional toll, the quiet grief for those who didn't survive, the camaraderie that bound her to her crew, and the responsibility that never left her even in retirement. "It's not enough to survive a mission," she said. "You carry it with you. Every life saved, every life lost, it shapes who you are. And you never stop thinking about it." Her voice carried a mix of sorrow and resolve, resonating with anyone who had known loss in service. The younger recruits listened intently, some with wide eyes and tense postures, realizing that courage wasn't only about skill or bravery, it was about endurance, resilience, and emotional intelligence. The veterans nodded subtly, recognizing the familiar weight of responsibility she described. The captain, ever discerning, allowed a moment for the lesson to sink in before pressing further. "Major Kane," he said, "how did you maintain composure under such impossible conditions? Fear is natural, and these missions sound unimaginable. How did you lead when others were paralyzed by it?" Lauren's eyes flickered briefly, reflecting the countless hours of calculation and focus she had practiced in life-or-death scenarios. She had faced fear many times, learned to channel it, and now shared that knowledge with those who would listen. "Fear," she explained, "is essential. It tells you what matters. It sharpens your senses, heightens your focus. But you cannot let it control your decisions. You acknowledge it, calculate, and act. That is courage, not the absence of fear, but mastery over it." The room seemed to lean into her words. Recruits scribbled notes, veterans nodded knowingly, and civilians simply absorbed the lesson, understanding intuitively the difference between panic and disciplined courage. She emphasized that leadership was not about ego or recognition. Every mission, every decision, required humility, discipline, and trust. Even the best pilots, soldiers, or leaders fail if they forget these principles, she said. Courage under fire is measured by precision, not bravado. By clarity, not noise. By the lives you protect, not the medals you earn. Her calm authority commanded attention without shouting, her experience lending gravity to every statement. The SEAL captain, who had commanded teams under extreme pressure, found himself unusually silent, considering her words. In his mind, he compared her experience to his own missions, recognizing the subtle differences and similarities, the reliance on training, the trust in teammates, the relentless pressure to succeed. He realized that Lauren Kane was not only recounting a story, but teaching a living, Lesson in Leadership and Composure Under Extreme Stress. Lauren then shared the human dimension of her missions, describing the trust placed in her by her co-pilot and the soldiers on the ground. She recounted moments where communication was minimal, reliance was absolute, and failure could cost lives. "No one survives alone," she said, her voice steady. "Even at 30,000 feet, your team depends on you, and you depend on them." Courage is not solitary, it's shared. The audience sat rapt, absorbing the subtle but profound implications. The younger recruits realized that leadership was not about asserting dominance, it was about inspiring confidence, calm, and precision in others. Veterans reflected on their own experiences, recognizing the authenticity of her story, the quiet authority in her presence. Even the captain, who had long considered himself unshakable, acknowledged the lesson she imparted. True courage is often invisible, and true leadership often speaks silently. One Marine, the same one who had questioned her earlier, finally spoke, voice slightly trembling. "Ma'am, thank you for what you did, for saving lives." His words carried weight beyond gratitude. They were recognition of the responsibility she bore, the skills she demonstrated, and the humility she maintained. Lauren nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without embellishment. She had not sought applause, only understanding, and this acknowledgment, quiet as it was, resonated deeply. She allowed a moment for the room to process. Then, she spoke of the balance between mission and humanity. "We are trained to accomplish objectives, yes, but we are human first. Empathy, responsibility, and awareness of the stakes are what guide decisions. You can't be fearless, you must be mindful, deliberate, and precise. That is what defines a true operator." Her words lingered, carried weight in a room filled with those who understood both the gravity of military service and the challenges of human frailty. The younger recruits seemed visibly changed, internalizing lessons far beyond technical skills. The veterans nodded in agreement, acknowledging the nuanced insight that only experience can impart. The captain remained silent for a moment, reflecting before finally speaking again. "Major Kane," he said, tone softened with respect, "you've given this room more than a story. You've given a lesson in leadership, courage, and composure. We don't often get to witness that firsthand. Thank you." Lauren inclined her head slightly, a gesture of humility. She had not come to receive accolades, and yet her presence commanded them naturally, without effort or boast. Finally, she concluded with a reminder that resonated deeply. The people you carry, the decisions you make, the composure you maintain, these are your real measures of success. Medals are secondary. What matters is that those who rely on you survive, and that you honor the trust placed in you. That is the lesson I want each of you to take away. The hangar erupted in subdued applause, punctuated by nods of understanding, whispered acknowledgments, and glances shared between those who had themselves faced the rigors of combat. Lauren Kane had captivated an audience, not through spectacle, but through authenticity, presence, and the depth of lived experience. In that moment, even the SEAL captain stepped back, recognizing that she had not only commanded attention, but had earned it. Her story, quiet yet powerful, would remain in the minds of all who heard it, a lesson in courage, humility, and the unspoken demands of leadership that few ever truly appreciate. The hangar had settled into a heavy silence, the kind that hangs after truth has been revealed. Lauren Kane stood at the podium, calm yet commanding, and the audience still felt the lingering weight of her words. Every veteran, recruit, and civilian had been drawn into her world of high-altitude danger, split-second decisions, and lives balanced on the edge of judgment. The SEAL captain, usually unshakable, seemed momentarily awed, his stern features softened by recognition of the magnitude of her experiences. Lauren scanned the room, noting subtle reactions. The younger recruits were pale, leaning forward with wide-eyed intensity, absorbing lessons that could never be learned in a classroom. Veterans exchanged quiet nods, recognizing the authenticity of her story and the depth of her skill. Some muttered under their breath, recalling past missions that mirrored her experiences. The room was alive with unspoken acknowledgement. Lauren Kane was extraordinary, and her presence had changed the energy of the hangar. The captain broke the silence, leaning toward the microphone. "Major Kane," he said, voice deliberate, "you've spoken about missions, about fear, about responsibility. But tell us, what was the moment that changed you? The one that made you realize you are no longer just a pilot, but someone who could make or save lives in impossible situations." Lauren paused, a faint shadow crossing her face as memories resurfaced. The mission he referred to was seared into her mind, a night when everything hung in a precarious balance, when decisions had to be instantaneous, precise, and irreversible. She inhaled slowly, centering herself before speaking, aware that every word carried weight, that every detail would be absorbed by those listening. "It was in the mountains," she began, voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "We were tasked with extracting a unit pinned down by enemy fire. The valley was narrow, the terrain unforgiving, and the enemy highly trained. My co-pilot froze in fear, and I realized in that instant that the responsibility was mine alone. Every life on that mountain depended on my composure and skill." The hangar seemed to lean in, hanging on her words. Veterans exchanged knowing glances. Some closed their eyes, recalling similar moments when everything depended on a single decision. The younger recruits held their breath, imagining the tension of life and death compressed into seconds. Even the civilians felt it, sensing the extraordinary gravity of her experience. Lauren spoke of the approach, the calculations, the constant mental adjustments she had made while under fire. Every movement of the aircraft, every adjustment to the throttle or rudder, had to be perfect. A single misjudgment would be catastrophic. She described the sound of bullets ricocheting, the roar of engines struggling against wind and gravity, the faint cries of soldiers relying on her precision. Her storytelling was meticulous, drawing the audience into the cockpit, into the tension of every heartbeat. She described the co-pilot's paralysis and how she had guided him, spoke to him in clipped, precise commands, and slowly restored his ability to act. "In that moment," she said, "I realized that leadership isn't about being the strongest or the fastest, it's about steadiness. It's about being the calm in the storm. Fear will always be present, but clarity, focus, and responsibility can overcome it." The audience remained captivated. The SEAL captain's gaze never wavered, studying her intently. He had faced his own moments of extreme stress. Yet there was a lesson here that transcended tactics or technical skill. It was about human endurance, about psychological and emotional mastery in the face of impossible odds. Recruits leaned forward, absorbing every nuance, while veterans nodded subtly, internalizing a truth they had learned through experience. True courage was measured in calm, not noise. Lauren then described the landing, the extraction, and the subsequent return to base. The aircraft had shuddered under the strain, wounded soldiers clinging to her guidance, and the weight of responsibility pressing down relentlessly. Every movement was calculated, every decision deliberate. She spoke of monitoring instruments, adjusting for unexpected wind currents, and coordinating with medics on the ground, all while managing her co-pilot's fear and the soldiers' distress. Her composure was absolute, yet her words conveyed the intensity of every second. "The helicopter became more than a machine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It became a lifeline. Every turn, every adjustment mattered. I wasn't just flying. I was carrying lives on my shoulders. And in that moment, I understood what it meant to be trusted with responsibility beyond myself. It changed me." The hangar remained silent. Every listener seemed to hold their breath, the weight of her experience settling into their bones. Veterans recognized the authenticity, recruits internalized the lesson, and civilians glimpsed the extraordinary burden of those who serve. The captain cleared his throat, visibly impressed. "That's the kind of composure we train for, but rarely witness firsthand," he said. "And you executed it flawlessly." Lauren allowed herself a brief pause, glancing at the medal on the podium and the photograph she had displayed earlier. She didn't need recognition, but the reminder of those who had relied on her brought a quiet, deep satisfaction. "Recognition," she said softly, "isn't what drives a mission. It's accountability, focus, and the knowledge that people are counting on you. Every life saved is the only reward that matters." She then shared a moment that had never been publicized. After the mission, she had walked through the base, witnessing the reactions of the soldiers she had rescued. Some silently nodded, others clasped her hand briefly, eyes filled with gratitude that words could not capture. She realized then that the most profound measure of success wasn't medals, commendations, or news articles. It was the silent acknowledgement of those whose lives she had touched. A recruit near the front shifted in his seat, absorbing her words. "Ma'am," he whispered to a friend, "she really lived through that?" His friend nodded, equally silent, realizing that the story wasn't exaggeration, it was reality. Veterans in the back murmured quietly, recalling their own experiences, silently recognizing that she had navigated a level of danger and responsibility that few could fathom. Lauren leaned slightly forward, emphasizing a point. The human element is everything. Machines, tactics, weapons, they matter, but they are secondary to people. Your own judgment, your calm, your ability to lead under stress, these define your mission. Fear is a tool, responsibility is the anchor, and trust is the bridge. Without these, even the best training fails. The audience was riveted. Each word resonated, not just as a recounting of experience, but as a lesson in psychological resilience, leadership, and the human condition under extreme circumstances. The captain remained quiet, letting her speak, recognizing that she was teaching through narrative, not instruction. Every nuance of her story imparted knowledge that could not be learned in books or classrooms. Lauren then reflected on the long-term impact of such missions. She spoke of sleep-deprived nights, replaying decisions in her mind, and the quiet contemplation of what could have gone wrong. "Every operator carries the weight of their choices," she said. "It's not something you can forget, but it is also what makes you stronger, more aware, and more capable of protecting those who depend on you." Veterans nodded knowingly, recalling their own internal battles after high-risk missions. Recruits, though younger and untested, began to grasp the invisible burden carried by those who lead in life-or-death scenarios. Civilians, witnessing the story unfold, felt a profound appreciation for the precision, composure, and emotional endurance required in military service. Finally, Lauren concluded this segment with a lesson that would linger long after the hangar emptied. Courage is quiet. Leadership is steady. Fear is acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate. Every decision, every movement, every act of composure defines whether people live or die. That is the truth of combat, and the lesson I want each of you to carry forward. The hangar erupted in quiet but heartfelt applause. Veterans, recruits, and civilians alike recognized that they had been in the presence of someone extraordinary, a pilot whose courage, skill, and quiet authority transcended rank or accolades. The SEAL captain nodded, acknowledging her mastery without words. Lauren Kane had commanded respect not by demand, but through presence, authenticity, and lived experience. As the applause settled into murmurs, Lauren stepped back slightly, allowing the audience to process the magnitude of her lessons. She had not only shared stories of survival, but imparted principles of leadership, composure, and responsibility that would resonate with everyone in the room. Every eye, every posture, every subtle gesture reflected newfound understanding and respect. The hangar had transformed. What began as a room filled with casual curiosity had become a chamber of respect, awe, and silent reflection. Lauren Kane stood quietly, yet the presence she exuded dominated the space. Her voice, calm and measured, had carried stories of life or death decisions, precision under fire, and leadership under unimaginable pressure. Veterans and recruits alike were leaning in, some scribbling notes, some simply staring, absorbing the gravity of her words. Even the SEAL captain, a man whose life had been defined by extraordinary courage, had shifted his posture, acknowledging the rare mastery before him. Lauren paused, letting the room digest her previous stories. She knew that the impact of combat wasn't in the medals, the news articles, or the recognition. It was in the quiet moments when decisions could mean life or death. And now, at this juncture, she would share the mission that had left the deepest mark on her soul, the one that had changed her perception of fear, responsibility, and leadership forever. It was a rescue mission, she began, her voice barely above the hum of the hangar lights, the kind you train for, but hope you never face. We were sent to extract a unit, trapped in a hostile urban environment, surrounded on all sides. Intel was sketchy, enemy positions constantly shifting, civilians caught in the crossfire. The helicopter became a lifeline, but the margin for error was non-existent. The audience leaned forward collectively. Younger recruits were gripping their notebooks, veterans were nodding subtly, and civilians felt the tension as if they were standing in the narrow streets she described. Every detail mattered, the altitude, the wind, the timing of each maneuver, and the mental calculations running through her mind at every moment. Lauren continued, painting the environment vividly. The streets were narrow, lined with crumbling buildings and debris. Enemy forces were firing from multiple angles. My co-pilot was tense, and for a moment, I saw panic in his eyes. I had to act decisively. Hesitation would cost lives. I guided him with clipped commands, coordinating every movement while keeping track of our approach, altitude, and escape route. It was the most delicate balance of skill and responsibility I had ever faced. The hangar was silent, every listener transported into the scene. Lauren's storytelling wasn't just dramatic, it was instructional. She conveyed the physics, the human element, and the stakes simultaneously. Veterans whispered to one another quietly, recognizing the precision in her tactics, while younger recruits struggled to imagine the weight of responsibility she bore. The captain's expression was unreadable, but there was no doubt he appreciated the expertise she was sharing. She described the extraction, the precise coordination required to land in an exposed area, load the trapped unit, and lift off under fire. Every second mattered. Every calculation could mean survival or disaster. She explained how she adjusted for shifting winds, weapon fire ricocheting around the fuselage, and the mental state of her co-pilot, who relied on her calm to steady his own nerves. Every decision had to be perfect, and in that moment, perfection wasn't a goal, it was survival. Lauren spoke of the soldiers she evacuated, noting their expressions, injuries, and silent trust. They depended on me completely, she said, her tone steady but carrying an edge of emotion. It's a burden you can never take lightly. You carry their lives, and with them, the weight of families, friends, and communities. One mistake, and it's not just a mission failed, it's lives lost. The room felt heavier with each word. Veterans knew this truth instinctively. The younger recruits were beginning to internalize it. Civilians were captivated, sensing for the first time the complexity of combat leadership and the profound responsibility shouldered by those in command. Even the captain, who had spent decades leading in extreme situations, seemed absorbed in every detail. Lauren's calm narration was teaching a lesson no textbook could replicate. She then revealed the turning point of the mission, a moment when chaos threatened to overwhelm her. A building collapsed as we approached, she said, eyes steady but reflecting the memory. Debris fell around us. Enemy fire intensified. My co-pilot froze for a heartbeat. And in that instant, I understood that leadership is not about controlling fear, it's about acting through it, guiding those around you, and making decisions that others cannot. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. Every listener understood the gravity of that statement. True courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery over it in the face of immediate danger. Lauren's words were a lesson in focus, responsibility, and resilience under pressure. She spoke not of heroism, but of the exacting discipline required to navigate life-or-death circumstances. She detailed the landing under fire, the precise positioning of the helicopter, and the coordinated effort to evacuate soldiers while avoiding both collapsing structures and enemy attacks. Her narrative included minute details of flight adjustments, altitude changes, and split-second decisions, all described with clarity that conveyed both technical mastery and emotional intelligence. The audience could almost feel the rotor vibrations, the heat of the nearby fires, and the tension in the cockpit. Lauren highlighted the human factor repeatedly. It's not about flying, she emphasized. It's about understanding the people you carry, the trust they place in you, and the consequences of every movement you make. Machines are predictable. Humans are not. And in combat, human lives are what define success or failure. Veterans nodded silently, while recruits scribbled notes furiously. Even civilians could sense the stakes involved. The captain's face, normally unreadable, betrayed a flicker of admiration. Lauren had not only described her technical expertise, but illuminated the essence of leadership, composure, and the human dimension of life and death decisions. She concluded the story with the return flight. Exhausted soldiers rested, their eyes wide with relief, while adrenaline still surged through her veins. She described the quiet moment of reflection upon returning to base, realization that she had carried lives through danger and returned them safely. That night, she said softly, I understood the full weight of responsibility. It changed me. It taught me that courage, precision, and calm under pressure are inseparable from the lives you protect. The audience remained silent, the gravity of her experience sinking in. The SEAL captain finally spoke, voice heavy with respect. Major Kane, you've given us more than a story. You've given a masterclass in courage, composure, and leadership. Few people truly understand what it takes to survive under those conditions, and even fewer can convey it with such clarity. Lauren inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without pride. She did not seek accolades. She sought understanding, respect, and the transmission of lessons hard-earned in combat. Around the hangar, veterans whispered quietly, acknowledging her mastery, while younger recruits seemed transformed by the realization that courage was measured not by heroics, but by precision, calm, and responsibility. Finally, she left the audience with one lesson that would resonate long after the session ended. Courage is silent. Leadership is steady. Fear is present, but mastered. Every decision, every movement, every choice defines lives. You carry not just soldiers, but families, communities, and trust. And that, more than anything else, is the measure of your mission and your character. The hangar erupted in applause, tempered by reverence. Lauren Kane had not just told a story, she had imparted the essence of true courage and leadership. The SEAL captain stepped back, acknowledging her presence with the rarest of nods. Complete respect for someone who had not only survived impossible missions, but returned with wisdom that could guide others. As the room slowly quieted, the younger recruits sat in reflective awe. Veterans exchanged subtle nods of understanding, and civilians lingered on her every word. Lauren Kane had transformed the hangar from a room of curiosity into a space of reflection, insight, and inspiration. She had proven that true heroism is often quiet, uncelebrated, and measured in the lives saved and the trust earned. The hangar was silent, but the silence now carried something heavier, a sense of culmination, of understanding, of respect earned. Lauren Kane had shared mission after mission, moment after moment, detailing courage, precision, and the quiet burden of responsibility that came with leadership. The audience, once skeptical and uncertain, now sat transfixed. Veterans nodded knowingly, recruits scribbled furiously in their notes, and civilians leaned forward, captivated by the depth and authenticity of her story. Even the SEAL captain, who rarely showed emotion, seemed deeply moved. Lauren paused, scanning the room one last time. Her eyes met those of the younger recruits, some awed, some anxious, all inspired. She could see in them the spark that would grow into professionalism, courage, and leadership. She had shared more than combat stories. She had shared the philosophy that defined her every action: composure under pressure, responsibility above ego, and the silent mastery of fear. These were lessons that could never be learned from a textbook or a simulator. "Every mission I've flown," she began, voice steady, "taught me something essential. Not about myself, but about those around me, the co-pilot, the soldiers, the people relying on me to bring them home. Courage is not heroic gestures or medals. It's focus. It's responsibility. It's making decisions when there is no room for error. That is what survival and leadership are truly about." A few veterans exchanged quiet glances, some murmuring assent, recognizing the familiar truth. The younger recruits absorbed each word, realizing that the lessons were as much about mindset and character as about technical skill. Lauren continued, recounting a final mission one that had tested not only her abilities as a pilot, but her endurance as a leader. "The night was dark, the winds unpredictable, and our intel incomplete," she said. "We were tasked with rescuing a team trapped behind enemy lines. Bullets traced paths around us. Buildings threatened to collapse. My co-pilot froze, and in that moment, the lives of every soldier depended on my clarity, my ability to act decisively under pressure. I had to guide him, control the aircraft, assess the situation, and ensure every life was protected all simultaneously." She described the extraction in vivid detail, conveying the tension of every second. The hum of the rotors, the shift of the aircraft under uneven weight, the cries of soldiers below, and the relentless pressure of incoming fire, all painted a picture of chaos that only precision, training, and mental fortitude could overcome. The audience sat in rapt attention, transported into her cockpit, feeling the stakes with each breath. "The soldiers trusted me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, even when fear threatened to paralyze them. "That trust is sacred. Leadership is sacred. It is not about recognition. It is about the responsibility of carrying others through danger." Veterans nodded knowingly. Younger recruits were wide-eyed, realizing that courage was as much about psychology as it was about skill. Even civilians felt the gravity of lives hanging on a single decision. Lauren spoke of landing in hostile terrain, coordinating the evacuation, and lifting off under enemy fire, each maneuver calculated with precision. She highlighted the human factor, the silent communication between her and her co-pilot, the trust from soldiers on the ground, and the awareness of civilian lives nearby. Every decision, she said, was a balance between strategy, instinct, and humanity. Success is not measured by medals. It's measured by lives saved and trust honored. The SEAL captain leaned forward, his expression unreadable, but his respect evident. Lauren had transformed the room from a casual assembly into a place of reflection and learning. She spoke not to impress, but to instill understanding, an understanding of fear, responsibility, and composure that no classroom or lecture could convey. The younger recruits absorbed every word, silently aware that these principles would define their future in service. She then reflected on the aftermath of missions. Returning home doesn't erase the weight of what you faced. You carry it with you, in quiet moments, in your decisions, in your relationships. That burden is heavy, but it teaches resilience. It teaches patience. It teaches the value of life, trust, and integrity. Her voice softened, but the impact of her words cut deep into the room. Lauren stepped closer to the audience, lowering her tone. I've shared these stories not for praise, but for clarity. To show you what leadership under fire truly means. It's not bravery for show. It's precision, composure, and respect for those whose lives you are charged to protect. If you take anything from my experiences, let it be this. Courage is silent, leadership is steady, and trust is sacred. The room remained silent for a heartbeat longer before applause began, quiet at first, and growing into a steady wave of recognition. Veterans stood, offering nods and subtle claps of acknowledgement. Recruits rose from their seats, some cheering softly, some holding back tears of admiration. Civilians, moved by the honesty and depth of her experience, joined in. The SEAL captain finally stepped forward, clapping deliberately, a rare smile breaking across his stern features. Major Kane, he said, voice resonant, you've given this room more than stories. You've given lessons that will last a lifetime. You've shown what true courage, leadership, and responsibility look like. We honor you not for medals, but for the example you set, and for the lives you've carried and protected. Lauren inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the respect without pride. She had not sought recognition. Her satisfaction came from the understanding, the comprehension that what she had shared was not just her experience, but a blueprint for leadership, courage, and composure. Around the hangar, veterans whispered quietly, recruits scribbled notes, and civilians reflected on what they had witnessed. A living demonstration of discipline, mastery, and humanity under pressure. As she prepared to leave the podium, Lauren paused one last time. Her eyes swept the room, and she allowed a small smile. Remember this, she said softly. Every decision you make, every action you take, carries weight. Carry it wisely. Lead with clarity. Trust in your training. Trust in your team. And above all, never underestimate the power of calm, focus, and responsibility. The hangar erupted in applause again, this time a mixture of admiration, respect, and gratitude. Lauren Kane had not only shared her story, but had imparted lessons that would echo far beyond the walls of that room. Veterans nodded with understanding. Recruits stared in awe, and civilians absorbed the depth of what it truly meant to serve, to lead, and to face fear without surrender. The SEAL captain extended his hand, and Lauren shook it firmly. Thank you for sharing this with us, he said. Few people have lived what you have, and even fewer can convey it with such clarity and humility. You've left an impression that will endure far beyond this day. Lauren stepped away from the podium, her heart steady, knowing she had accomplished what she intended. She had not sought applause, but she had earned it. The room, filled with soldiers, leaders, and civilians alike, understood something profound. Courage is quiet, leadership is steady, and true mastery comes not from recognition, but from responsibility carried with unwavering focus. As she exited the hangar, whispers of admiration followed her, and the sense of inspiration lingered in the air. The story of Lauren Kane, the pilot who had faced impossible odds, commanded respect through presence, and demonstrated courage under fire, would remain with everyone who had heard it. The lessons she imparted, the lives she saved, and the trust she honored had cemented her place, not just as a combat pilot, but as a living embodiment of leadership, composure, and quiet heroism. And as the doors closed behind her, the SEAL captain turned to the room and said, almost to himself, there aren't many like her, and we're lucky to witness her example. The words hung in the air, a quiet testament to the extraordinary life and career of Major Lauren Kane.